welcome everyone. My name is Aidan Peppin. I'm the Policy and Responsible AI Lead at Cohere for AI. And this technical governance series is our way of trying to discuss a range of topics around the governance of AI and bring them to a broader conversation. For those of you that don't know Cohere for AI, we are Cohere's nonprofit research lab, and we support fundamental research on machine learning through open science approaches. So through that work, we get to engage in a range of conversations about AI governance, tech policy, and we interact with a lot of people who have deep expertise on those topics. And so what we do in these sessions is bring those experts and the conversations that we have with them to a broader audience. And the goal is not to present a particular position or rehash old ground, but pick a single topic, explore a bunch of questions on it in depth, and hopefully learn something along the way. I certainly always do. This month, we're discussing collective, inclusive, and participatory AI governance, or in other words, how do we ensure that AI technologies are designed, built, deployed, overseen, governed in ways that are more representative of the people that those technologies may be affecting. To discuss that, I am joined by two fantastic people. Dr. Tina Park, the head of inclusive research and design, at Partnership on AI. Hey, Tina. And Saffron Huang, who is the co-founder and research director at the Collective Intelligence Project. Thank you both for joining. I'm really excited to have the conversation. So the way this usually works, I have some questions to guide the discussion. We have a conversation about it, but my favorite thing about these sessions are the audience questions. So for those of you listening in, there's the Q&A function. If you bring up the menu at the bottom of the screen, please do drop questions in, and I'll make sure that we cover those in the discussion. So without further ado, let's get started. And I want to start with the broader end of things. What do we mean by collective, inclusive, and participatory input, and why does it matter for the governance of AI? I would love to hear both of your thoughts on that broad starter for 10 question. Maybe Tina, I'll let you kick off.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to join you all this morning. Again, I'm from Partnership on AI. So we are a multi-stakeholder nonprofit organization working on responsible AI practices for the field. I'm working specifically with a group of about 18 different experts from academia, industry, and civil society on this question of like inclusive and participatory AI. And the definition that we've opted to take is really thinking about inclusion and exclusion as sort of this binary that is constantly in operation because of how society, unfortunately, is really structured. So my background also, I should note, is as a sociologist. So I think a lot about sort of not just the interpersonal dynamics that we have, but also thinking about the ways in which power operates, decision-making operates, how our organizations are structured, how society is structured, that makes it really difficult, if not impossible, for some people to be part of these really important conversations and have the authority to make decisions, while others get much more easier access, whether it's because of their social identity, their position within society, the roles that they occupy. And so we really start there in thinking about what does that mean? And so it's really thinking about who is part of the process, who is excluded. And in our case, we really focus on who is excluded and think about what are the different reasons why their participation isn't permitted, whether that is sort of accidental, like just we aren't thinking about it, and that's a bit more benign on that front, that we just didn't think about them as a really specific community that needs to be outreach to, but also thinking about some of the structures that operate in the background, right? So racism, sexism, colonialism, all of those big sort of scary things. And then also think about just ways in which we might be intentional about hyper fixating on large scale markets rather than thinking about the people who might be really deeply harmed and impacted by the technology's development or deployment. And trying to draw practitioners' attention really to those folks to think about who's not being centered in this process. Because at the end of the day, we are making a lot of design choices around whose needs and experiences are getting enhanced or supported versus whose can't be as easily. And so for us, we really have an equity-driven approach to this. And so we think about who's not part of the process, what would it look like for them to be part of it? How do we need to shift timelines, resourcing, et cetera? And we really want folks to understand some of those larger social issues so that they can approach that question a little bit more easily.
Thanks, Tina. Already loads of stuff I want to dig into there, especially the kind of like, just the sort of that point you made around, accidental, like how much of this is just because people aren't thinking enough versus how much because people are thinking about one thing and not another. So yeah, loads we can dive into, but Saffron, over to you. Same question. What do you think about when you hear sort of terms around collective, inclusive, and participatory design in AI?
Yeah, great question to start. I think the way that we've been thinking about it at the Collective Intelligence Project, or CIP, is maybe I'll start with like the way that CIP thinks about its mission, which is, CIP is a nonprofit which looks to improve how we collectively make decisions about the frontier technologies that are going to shape everyone's lives. And we think that this is really important because, I mean, I think having more collective governance, like more kind of democratic ways of more democratic decision-making mechanisms in society is generally good. But I think specifically, like that's already broad, but specifically scoping that down to frontier technologies is something we've done because this is like a kind of area of society which is really not touched by like the various collective intelligence mechanisms that we generally have. Like, democracy, we don't really vote on like technological development. Like there's not a lot of kind of public input into that so far. Also in terms of markets, like it's not like, oh, these are efficient markets or like, the free market is just going to decide this because as anyone that's sort of familiar with venture capital knows, or the way that kind of startups are generally funded in contemporary society, it's pretty distorted. Like it's not really like an efficient market at all. And so thinking about like, okay, are there ways that we can more better structure the way we think about and make decisions about important upcoming technologies that have better guarantees of taking into account like the benefit of more people, the sort of collective benefit, rather than just kind of being driven by the decisions of the people who build the technologies, like the people who know how they work. So kind of like moving more decision-making power to more people who are going to be affected by the technologies is the kind of broad starting point that we have. And we've been focusing a lot on AI recently. I mean, because, this is something that I have a lot of personal experience with. I used to work at DeepMind as a research engineer. Divya, my co-founder and who's the executive director, has also kind of worked a lot on AI policy when she was at Microsoft. So, and obviously it's kind of an interesting moment for thinking about specifically shaping AI governance because it's such a sort of open-ended general purpose technology that does have the potential of shaping many, many different areas of people's lives. And so obviously the sort of like scope of impact is really broad, which makes it something that, we think it's important to have broader input on. And, it's at an interesting point where the technology is still pretty nascent. It's still not really specifically talking about like generative AI, language models, transformers, like that kind of that kind of AI. That technology is at an interesting place because it still doesn't have like incredibly broad adoption or sort of integration into various functions in society, but there's enough media attention that, like I think the polling is like at this point, most Americans have heard of ChatGPT. Like a lot of people have kind of like used these technologies, are aware of them to some extent. And so you can start like talking to people and getting that public input on what do you think of this? Like, what direction do you think this is going? Like, what things do you think shouldn't be automated ever that like humans should always do? And kind of have that conversation ahead of it being like a really kind of it's all the decisions have been made, basically. Like, we're not there yet. So I think it's a really great time to do some of this work when it's early enough to be shaped. But kind of, there's enough education that people can talk about it. Although, as Tina is mentioning, like, there are a lot of barriers to kind of having an equitable conversation about it, or having a conversation where people are kind of on the same page. So yeah, thinking about, and one other thing I'll say about like how we think about collective or inclusive AI is thinking a lot about the AI development pipeline or life cycle, and then thinking about like leverage points within that life cycle where decisions could be made by a broader set of people, or a broader set of people could sort of affect the status quo. So for example, thinking about, okay, when you train a language model, you collect the data and you train the model on the initial training data, and then you do a fine tuning step, and then maybe you run some evaluations, you have some trust and safety folks come in, there are various things, and then you deploy it, and then you kind of get feedback on that. And so we've been thinking very practically and pragmatically about like, what in here could we bring public input to effect, and we've kind of done some work on the kind of setting the rules or setting the behaviors of the language model, or thinking about what evaluations should we prioritize to build to understand risk. So I'll kind of stop talking, but I think that's, in terms of thinking about like what participation means, like starting as concretely as possible with like, what does AI development look like right now, and what things could be more participatory within that, that sort of like, that aren't yet, and that could kind of open the door to more participation down the line.
Thanks, Saffron. Also, for the record, no need to ever stop talking. The whole point of this is to hear your brilliant thoughts. I'm really glad you brought up the life cycle thing, because as you were kind of talking before, and as Tina was talking, it was making me think about similar things that actually, I guess the breadth of the technologies that we're considering here, and the fact that AI models are often very general purpose, means that the way that participation might look is very dependent on where in that deployment development life cycle you want to pinpoint. And I'm thinking of something like the collective constitution work that CIP did, which was, I guess, sort of at that higher level and general purpose level to influence some of those higher principles, compared with, say, some of the stuff that I did in a previous role at the Ada Lovelace Institute, where we were looking really specifically at biometric technology and facial recognition, which obviously draws on image recognition algorithms as a general purpose technology, but looks at them in a very specific context, which is, policing, surveillance, etc. And the way that the kinds of questions that you would ask, the kind of people that you would include, the way those people would be included looks so different depending on that point. So I'm really glad you brought that up. It's, I think, something really important into this space, and kind of leads me into the sort of, I guess, next question I had. But Tina, I saw you nodding along with Saffron, and I saw you maybe scribbling notes. So I just wanted to check there was nothing that you wanted to come in on before I ask another question.
No, jump in. And yes, I'm taking old school notes with a pen and paper. So
all good. That's what we're here
Those
for.
are the best.
So I mean the sort of next sort of, I guess, sub question that I was thinking about with both your comments, and both of you talked about markets, which I think is really interesting, and whether we like it or not, we have to accept that the way the modern world operates is very market driven, or at least intertwined with the market. And so I'm wondering, where are you both seeing concepts around participation and inclusion and collective input interacting with and aligning with some of the things that already exists in the way that technology has been, I guess, produced through markets? Where are some of the friction points come out? I'm thinking, for example, of when I was doing some work around this space before, I was really thinking about, okay, I'm really keen to bring more participatory input to the way that technology is designed. Technology design has a kind of human computer interaction UX component already. Is that the way in? But yeah, I'm curious for both of your thoughts on that. And I'm not going to assign. I'm going to see which one of you wants to jump in.
I think go first this
Yeah.
time. Yeah, I think my thoughts here are I think that we at CIP are thinking about collective input, not just into the design of the technology and the user interface as kind of UX research or user research or, HCI often scopes more towards. Like we're thinking about it in terms of people being able to determine the impact that this technology, have some say about the impact that this technology has in their lives, in society, like what kind of future they want to see. And so that tends to become broader than HSA. It becomes more like governance, more sort of like collective governance questions. We did this process asking people like about what risks and harms they were most concerned about when it came to generative AI, and used that to say, okay, here are the kind of like evaluations that we think that AI companies should prioritize developing, informed by this public input, or here are sort of like monitoring mechanisms that need to be in place to catch things like, for example, people were in this process were really concerned about over reliance on something they didn't understand, which I think is a really interesting and kind of subtle and complex thing to think about preventing. And in a lot of ways, this is like antithetical to market incentives, right? Like over reliance is good for business. It's like, yeah, like people are over reliance is in some ways the thing that companies want. And I think the tricky thing here is defining like what do people mean by over reliance. The thing, over reliance on something you don't understand is kind of this like worry about agency being taken away or not being able to do something without it or losing skills or automation bias or something like that. And I think that's not work that I've seen many of the sort of AI labs doing, but it would be really great to have work there or, various kinds of work in academia or in the public sector around that. And so that ends up being much, I think, less it doesn't necessarily cash out into like we should design the technology differently or we should design the interaction with the technology differently, although it can, I think. So that is some work that we've also done around kind of getting more collective input into determining the behaviors or the rule set that the sort of LLM chatbot abides by when it behaves. So those just feel more scope, but I think the worry is that like participatory input or participatory AI stops at input into like fairly pre-scoped narrow questions that in the end the engineers or the executives like set the agenda versus kind of like leaning more towards like the public sets the agenda.
You opened up a lot of different avenues, Saffron, so thank you. You're making me think of a lot of different things. So I kind of want to answer two different questions that were posed. So I think there's one piece around that development lifecycle. And I agree with Saffron. We kind of have to distinguish between the participatory engagement that we want for AI governance. So establishing the ground rules around like, what do we want built? What don't we want in operation? I think is always a really important question that we need to be asking, of saying like, no, we should not be building this. We should not be encouraging the building of this. This is actually really bad for society. We should have the room to talk about those things, or think about the ways in which things that may work well for 80% of the population works really terribly for 20%, right? So going back to your example around biometric, generally there's a lot of enthusiasm for it because it's easy, it feels highly secure, and it's a great alternative to say written passwords, depending on your level of literacy. But at the same time, if you are a highly surveilled, someone within a highly surveilled community, biometric is really easy to take from you when you are in a detention center, for example. It can be coerced out of you much more easily than say a long, 16 character password to access your devices. And so I think we need those kinds of spaces to think about some of the larger questions, But we also do need to think about like, what does it look like when it's at that product or service or system design level? And those are slightly different questions. They're very interrelated and they should be pinging off of each other. But in those cases, I do think it's important that we recognize like, yeah, we have some sort of existing avenues in that have where it's not a new concept to bring in sort of more human-centered, people-oriented, community-centering mechanisms and practices into that space. So HCI, like you mentioned, human-computer interaction. I think a lot of UX researchers have really started to explore like not just doing sort of a one-to-one UX research type thing, but also trying to understand like the overall experiences of larger user groups and understanding some of the bigger systematic issues that impact them. And so I'm noticing that a lot of UX researchers, for example, are trying to come in better educated about the different stakeholder groups and user groups that they're trying to work with, say whether they have like, they're working with communities with disabilities, for example, actually coming in with a bit of background knowledge around some of the structural barriers that people with, say, physical disabilities or cognitive disabilities might experience, so that they have sort of also some information and understanding of some of these big structural issues in the same way that we kind of want users and stakeholders to have some degree of understanding now about the technology to even out that conversation. And so I think we have some of these avenues, they aren't in conflict, but I want to point out that they're not always in alignment either. Because you do have to take that extra step to think about like, who are you trying to reach and why are you trying to talk to them and what kind of information and insights are you trying to draw from them? And I think when you just think about it very flatly as like all humans are the same, and there's sort of a universal user or sort of an average that you want to target, that again sort of can sort of reiterate some of that exclusionary behaviors that we've seen in the field and just in society more generally. And so I think there needs to be an added layer of like, when we adopt some of these existing sort of fields of study that we can apply on participatory practices, thinking about, again, who has been excluded, can we, what do we need to do differently in order to get their input? What do we need to know about their communities and the interactions that they've had either with our company, with the field of technology or AI in general, or just with corporations, right? That might prevent their sort of most mutually beneficial interaction that they can have and the least extractive interaction that they can have. And I think that's sort of a new layer that we really need to think about more deeply, because more often than not, I think, especially in market-driven sectors like ours, we tend to think about the average user because it allows us to capture the most of the market with the least amount of effort. And this is where I think we've come into a lot of problems where that exclusion piece, like who gets left out, ends up having a lot of impact in terms of people are completely excluded from the use of certain beneficial technologies, or it doesn't work for them, or it works against their interests in really deeply harmful ways. And so it's not enough for us, I think, as a field to think about it as just like targeting the average user, but again, thinking about those at the margins and adding that to the work that we already have available for us.
One of the things that's really struck me in some of the work I've done on this is actually as well how when you ask the 20%, 10%, 5% of people that would normally be excluded, often the solutions or the ideas or the perspectives they have kind of improve things for everyone as well. So it's I completely with you, Tina, as well, that it's so crucial to make sure that just because it works for 80%, it doesn't work against the other 20%, but often, you can find solutions which improve things in the round as well. That is also a key thing not to be missed, and another reason why this stuff matters so much. So yeah, I really appreciate the perspective. And it's also making me think a little bit as well about I guess I was going to say who's organizing the participation, but that again implies a power dynamic. But you know what I mean? Which organizations, which actors are, I guess, facilitating, sponsoring, engaging with participatory inclusive practices? Because the way that a technology developer, whether that's an AI developer or a product developer, would do it might look different to the way a governance body would do it. And I think, Saffron, some of the points you were saying before around, if it's those questions of what technologies do we want? What do we want them to do for us? What do we want our society to look like that's mediated by these technologies? Well, actually, different organizations that engage with those kinds of questions have different abilities to do things about that through, not just building a technology which responds to that question, but mandating what other companies or organizations that are building this technology could look like. So, yeah, really appreciate your thoughts. I want to bring the conversation to some maybe kind of practical examples and specifics. Really curious to know both of you. I mean, CIP does fantastic projects and work. Tina, the work that you're doing at PAI is engaging with a whole range of people who are, on the ground doing great projects. So it'd be fantastic, I think, for the folks listening in to hear a little bit more about some of those projects. So maybe Tina, I'll come to you first. Are there any particular projects that folks in your network or the PAI Partnership on AI kind of involved with and running that you're excited about in terms of where participation and inclusion is being done well? And just before you answer, we've already had one question in on the Q&A. Please keep them coming. I will make sure that we find time in the conversation to get to all your questions. So please do keep the questions coming. But yeah, Tina.
Yes, so I would be remiss to not first flag the project that I'm leading, which is with our global task force. We are getting ready to release some guidance specifically oriented towards practitioners who are developing in the commercial or corporate sector space who want to do this, because we want to recognize that folks working within the commercial space have really specific dynamics that they have to navigate through in order to do this work with different communities, particularly socially marginalized communities. And so we'll be outlining some guidance on that. We're going to actually release it for public consultation ourselves. So I'm working with a bunch of excellent human beings, but with years and years and years of experience thinking about this. However, that is not sufficient. And so we'll be doing a lot of public outreach to find out where we got things right, where we got things wrong, what things can be improved. And so we'll be doing that for the rest of the year. And then hopefully by the early part of next year, we'll have a final resource to actually share with everyone and get that circulated. But in terms of some of the examples that I've seen in terms of participatory like technology and AI development projects that I've seen, 3 really come to mind. And they sort of range from the product development side to the governance, which I will try to go through them really fast because I love these examples. So one is Tehuku Media, which is based in New Zealand, which has had a ton of conversations around them because of the great, excellent pieces by Karen Howe. But they are a natural language processing technology specifically for the Maori language. And I think one thing that's really great about them is specifically their board is it's made up largely of community elders. So it's not technologists. They're people whose real mission and the thing that's most important to them is protecting the Maori community and protecting the Maori language. And so I think the incentives there are different, and the technologists have to really figure out and think about ways of how they do their work in a way that doesn't undermine the well-being of an entire community. And they have a board that actually constitutes those voices to make sure that they're doing that work well. And they have final decision-making, which I think is really important, right? Like we oftentimes might see a decision-making board where there's a handful of maybe voices from the community, but they might be outnumbered by sort of some of the technologists who are more fixated on whether or not the technology is working the way that they want it to work, rather than is the way that we're doing it, is what we're producing, is the product that we're releasing and how we're releasing it actually in the interest of the communities that we're trying to serve. And so I think they're one really great example of how you can build some really cool tech that is incredibly important in a way that's paced and in collaboration and in direct community with the folks that you're trying to serve. The second one is sort of old but new. So the developer of Design from the Margins, which is a really specific methodology around how you work with what they refer to as decentered users. So people who are very much at the margins because they are oftentimes criminalized by society. And so this might be folks who are identified as LGBTQ in areas where being out is illegal and can land you in jail, if not worse. And so what does it mean to actually develop technology and make adaptations and changes to what exists in order to make sure that they don't get further criminalized and further harmed? And so they just stood up a whole new center to continue this research based on the design from the margins. But if you're looking for a really practical set of tools and guidances, I think they have a really great set of resources, and they just released a series of reports around queer tech in the Middle East and North Africa region. It is so rich in both detail around the political context that they're working in, the methodologies that they needed to use, and the actual recommendations provided to tech companies that have software and products out in those regions around how to make sure that their products don't actually harm the queer community in those areas. The last one is a small one, but it's a really, really interesting one, which is the city of Portland in the United States. They undertook sort of a series of projects to do better tech governance. So they were developing their own cities, policies around the adoption of surveillance technology and AI tools for their city. And the way that they did it was, I think, really incredible, because it was a longer process where they wanted to have a lot of input from the community. One of the great things that they did is they actually hired community leads. So people who are known, have been working in some of the socially marginalized communities within their city for a long time. And they asked them to come in, they were paid, they were trained to actually lead that engagement process. So rather than it just being like some city members of the city, like government trying to do this work without those relationships, they actually asked the people who have really deep, meaningful relationships with the communities that tend to be targeted by some of these technologies to lead the way. And so one of the interesting things that they did as part of their engagement process was they actually opened up the engagement process as a whole for scrutiny. So they're like, here's who we're planning to talk to. Who did we miss? Who should be part of the conversation? What is the best way to reach out to them? And they sort of took a step back to do that, a bit of that meta-analysis, and they did it with these paid community leads. And they did this over the course of a year, and they had a ton of workshops. They released some really interesting resources, like a zine that talks about what digital justice is. So they went back to some basics to really make sure that the folks that they're talking to are better informed, so that they can leverage the experience and the expertise that they have in their own domain to really give some solid input around how technology should be governed for their city. And so those are three examples that I'm always really excited to talk about around things that are happening right now that are really thoughtfully done, I think. And so much of it ends up means it's about working with smaller communities of people. And so that's what we love to see.
Thanks, Tina. I love those examples, because I think as well it shows how these projects are happening all over the world and in all kinds of different ways. So thank you so much. Those were fantastic. And I'm really glad you started by plugging partnership on AI's work, because that's totally acceptable. And I for one, am excited to see the guidance when it starts to come through. Saffron, over to you. Please share some projects that you're working on, excited about, and of course, plug away all of Collective Intelligence Project's cool stuff as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think I'll mention a couple of things that we have done, and briefly mention some things that were that are more in the works. So in terms of things that we've done, last year we spent a lot of time working on what we call alignment assemblies. So this is our way of putting together concepts from both sort of technology and democracy communities, and basically trying to bring technology and democracy closer together. And thinking about how do you assemble people, regular people, to talk about and make decisions about the technologies that are shaping their lives, or bringing that technology closer in alignment with the things that they care about. And we started from I'm going to mention things that kind of look more different from working kind of closely with specific communities, just to kind of give a sense of the range of what sort of participatory AI might look like. But basically what we did is we ran a series of different alignment assemblies around the world, and we also kind of tried to write about it and publish about it in a way where other people could also run their own alignment assemblies. So for example, some of the things that we did was we worked with, I think the most kind of one of the most successful things that we did, I think, was our partnership with Anthropic. So I think the way that we started, as I mentioned, was fairly pragmatic, like thinking about like how can we think about decisions that are happening today and get more public input in like quickly, and in a way that is sort of commensurate with the speed of the sort of technological development, which is a challenge I can mention again later when we talk more about challenges. But basically, starting with like, where are the decision makers right now, and how can we get them thinking about more participatory input into the decisions they're making right now? So we reached out to Anthropic because they had just put out this algorithm called constitutional AI, which is basically a way of fine-tuning models to follow a written list of rules, in terms of like the model kind of will learn to follow the kind of written list of rules, in terms of how it behaves when deployed as a chatbot. And other methodologies, before constitutional AI came out, tended to center more around, you have a lot of raters, human raters, who are employed to kind of say, I like this model output more than that model output, and that kind of creates this big data set that then they train the model to follow. And so we're like, oh, this is really interesting. Having a explicit written set of rules versus this giant data set of like A is better than B, is a much better entry point for debate, and for people to gather around and say, yeah, like that rule seems good, this rule doesn't. It's just like a better, I think, leverage point for democratic oversight, essentially. So we were like, oh, this is great. We should see if we could get like, a wide participatory process to set the rules for this chatbot through constitutional AI, versus just having the engineers write the constitution, which is what was happening. That was like the status quo. And so we went to Anthropic. We kind of proposed this idea of collective constitutional AI. They were really into it. And so we kind of ran this process where we also have this interesting kind of industry partnership set of like industry partnership principles, where we're like, well, we're a nonprofit, like we don't just want to, we have like a vision of what we want kind of technology governance to look like. We don't necessarily just want to be a service delivery organization for AI labs, kind of providing them something that is useful, being a consultant. Like we kind of want to challenge them a little bit. And so we laid out these like industry partnership principles, where we're like, well, CIP is in charge of designing and running the whole public input process. You're in charge of the model training part. We are allowed to kind of make as many things transparent as we want to. We want to expand this. We want to like have partnerships with other organizations, like basically laying out in advance, like, here are the terms of this partnership. I think, and then we kind of ran this process where we took care of the public input part, which was, we went to 1,000 Americans. It was representative across age, gender, income, and geography lines. I learned via this process that about half of the Americans live in the South, which I didn't know. I was just like, learned very interesting things about demographics here. But yeah, so, half of participants were in the South, like, age-wise was like representative. And then we kind of asked them, what rules would you like to see an AI chatbot, such as ChatGPT, such as Bard, whatever, follow? We got some really interesting input, and it was actually not very politicized along kind of traditional political lines. And people had a lot of agreement on certain things. I mean, they didn't agree on everything. Like they were interesting. Like somebody said, oh, the AI should like be a ordained minister or something, and most people just like did not agree with that, obviously, so that didn't make it in. But we kind of had a process for choosing the rules with the most consensus, and then training the chatbot to follow it. So we trained 2 chatbots, one with the Anthropic written constitution, one with the collectively written constitution, and we evaluated them side by side. And the collectively written constitution was less biased on all of the bias dimensions of the kind of LLM bias benchmark that a lot of people use. It's called BBQ. And so along kind of age bias lines, gender bias, disability bias, nationality, like it was all less biased on the collectively written constitution. So what I think is interesting is the more inclusively written constitution created a more inclusive model, which I think is very cool. I thought it was really cool that we could actually measure impact, or we had some way of measuring some dimension of impact. And then in terms of performance, like they were equally performant on, you know, the math understanding or the language understanding benchmarks, and raters preferred them equally. So that was kind of like an initial proof of concept almost, where we were like, look, this thing is possible and desirable. And Anthropic ended up kind of presenting that to a bunch of policymakers, and also ended up incorporating some of the rules from our process into their next generation of Claude models. So it like actually made it into production, which we were really happy about. One of the other things we did was a little less specifically scoped into like affecting the model directly. We did this partnership with OpenAI, and it was the thing I was talking about like getting people to shape what evaluations are actually deployed or developed within the company. So evaluations are kind of the thing that people use to test the model, to understand how the model is going to impact, you know, for example, like, can the model tell you how to build a bomb, or, you know, how biased is the model, or like this is kind of all grouped under what we would call evaluations. And you know, there are not very many evaluations developed because they're pretty resource intensive and difficult. And again, you know, maybe it shouldn't just be folks at OpenAI determining what evaluations are most important. So we ran this process being like, hey, you know, what does the broader public think should be developed in terms of evaluations? And they talked about over-reliance and things that were very interesting, but I do think that one was challenging because there was a less clearly scoped output for it. It was sort of like, you know, we wanted to affect internal governance at OpenAI, which is quite a difficult thing for an external entity to try and do. And I think generally, like, you know, these companies' governance structures are not really set up to receive input like that. And so I think there's work to be done in terms of making that more possible. We also did some work with the Taiwanese government and also the UK government in terms of, on the one hand, asking people what information integrity measures should be put in place given, you know, the risk of deepfakes and things like that. And then on the other hand, thinking about, you know, with the UK government, how do people feel about anthropomorphism? This is something I'm very interested in. Like, how do people feel about really human-like AI that you could form relationships with, or just sort of maybe over trust? And are there boundaries there? And so we did basically a survey on that. But Divya and I worked at the UK government for a while at the AI Safety Institute, and kind of tried to build up like this sort of like democratic mechanism there. But I think, you know, working with governments are in some ways a very natural partner for things like this, because democratic governments are supposed to act according to the will of the people, and so have done some work there as well. Yeah, I'll post it. Oh, I'll really quickly plug that the stuff that we're doing this year is moving a little bit more in the direction of the tooling that we have to run some of these processes, and the processes that we have don't really work at a speed or scale commensurate with the impact of some of these general purpose AI technologies. And so we are working on more building tools that will help us kind of have more people's voices in these decisions, but in a way that is like a little bit faster and a little bit more commensurate with the speed of decision making. So I can say a bit more about that. But yeah, moving a little bit more into like a tool building direction.
Thanks, Saffron. That's all really fascinating. And I think, again, a lot of the examples you've referenced there, a lot of that work that you and your colleagues, Divya and co have been doing, I think, again, highlights the variety of types of participation, but also you spoke about lots of different examples of types of organization, governments, AI developers that the work has been plugged into and the differences in what that looks like. And something I jotted down was just, there's something around kind of collectively setting the rules that the people making technology then need to follow. And, you sort of say, this is the task you have, you should be the one that solves it. And I think sometimes that flips on the head what people expect participation to do, which is like, oh, there's this problem, I will just ask the people what the answer is. And I think you sort of it's sometimes that's great because that collective knowledge and that lived experience is crucial to finding the right answer. But I think there are other settings where actually the task is more setting the scope of the challenge that the people, who should be accountable to solving those challenges then need to rise to. I also jotted down Futurama because you mentioned an AI minister, and for some reason Futurama popped into my head. I don't know if that's useful. Tina, I saw you've responded to a couple of the questions in the chat, so thank you. So one of the questions from Elise was, could we share resources that the speakers are mentioning following during the call? So Tina, you've already popped a bunch of links in. Saffron, if there's links that you want to drop in now, do so. But also maybe I can gather up some links from the both of you by email, and then we can tweet them out so they can come from the Cohere For AI channel. And then Tina, I saw you'd answered the question from Ed around a lot of limited research being done on the implication of AI in the global south that might lead to blind spots with global consequences. So how do we ensure more safety researchers work on that? I don't know if you wanted to just talk through a little bit of what you ended up typing in.
Yeah, and I think it actually relates a little bit to what you were just saying, and what Saffron was saying around sort of, the persistence with which we need to be tapping into communities in order to have good governance. And part of what I always want to say is like the work is there. I know I primarily work in the United States, and for me, it's always trying to overcome my own sort of limited view of the field to see what other work is out there. And I will say, folks from the global south, from global majority countries, have been talking about this. They've been doing the research, they've been collecting the narratives and the stories, and they've been collecting the data. It just may not always show up in the venues that are most easily accessible to us as someone maybe working in the West, because like our conference venues are expensive, and that's primarily where we tend to publish. And so I just want to push back a little bit and say that the work is out there. I dropped in a link for an alliance that's formed between Data Privacy Brazil, based in Brazil, Opti Institute, which is a research institute based in India, and then Paradigm Initiative, which works sort of within the African continent, mostly within sub-Saharan Africa, but also a research and programmatic organization. They came together to sort of highlight and better promote the work that they and their peer organizations are doing. But the work is out there. And so I think something that we really need to be mindful of, especially as organizations that work in the West, is to not reinvent the wheel over and over again and ask the same questions when they've been answered so many times in so many different ways. And so we know that there are particular harms that arise. We know that there are some really questionable labor practices that come up, especially around things like data enrichment. We know that there have been well-documented cases around how non-European, non-US based markets are used as beta testing grounds for questionable changes to products or policies. So we know these things, and I think it is really up to us to do some of that background research and that desk research to get better informed before we sort of go back out to people to sort of ask them the questions that they've already sort of talked to us ad nauseum about. And again, that cuts across not just sort of regions in the global south, but also just with other socially marginalized communities. There's so many great resources out there now that talk about issues around racial bias, gender bias, around queer issues, around issues around accessibility and disability, that we should not really have to ask for some of the basic fundamental principles that we should be following. They've provided them already. Those communities have already spoken for themselves. And so sort of just want to make sure we get that point across.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Tina. And actually, I'm gonna use this topic to talk a little bit about, as an excuse to talk briefly about some of the work we've done at C4AI around Aya, which is, for those that aren't familiar, a multilingual language model project where we took some open models and we worked with 3,000 volunteer researchers across 120 countries to build a fine-tuning data set across 101 languages, 50 of which were completely underserved by existing language models prior to that, and we fine-tuned the models on them so that you have language models which have capability in many languages that previously were just ignored by this technology space. And through that work, a lot of the folks we collaborated with were people that were already doing fantastic work in language and culture preservation in the countries that they're based in, the cultures that they're based in, and so many of them are passionate and interested in ensuring that we don't just improve the capabilities of say language technologies across the breadth of languages that there are, but we're also addressing some of the baked in Western biases around cultural perspectives as well. So I say that to kind of reinforce the point, and that Tina's making, that this work is out there. There are people out there working on this stuff and they want to get engaged. And maybe the question is not so much how do we make sure that work is happening, but how do we make sure the sort of dominant power holders that tend to be Western organizations and Western governments are paying attention to that work and connecting with it. So yeah, thank you for the question, Ed. I think it's really important, and I'm grateful, Tina, for your thoughts. And also, I see that both of you have put loads of links in. So yeah, we'll copy all of those and we'll tweet those out that for other awareness. There's another question that's come in. Saffron, I can see you're already typing an answer. This is Dave's question around how rules and value statements will be consistently updated over time, or is it a snapshot? I don't know how far you are along with typing your answer, but I was going to throw the mic over to you to reflect on that, because I thought that speaks quite a lot to the stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, that sounds good. So yes, I think that consistent updating over time is really important and needs to be resourced. It's a kind of a question of, are your systems set up to do that? And yeah, resourced enough to do that. And I think that really needs to be done. I think that geography is really important. I think Dave, you said, how do you imagine this working across geographical contexts? Is geography the most significant variable here? I think it's very important and a challenge, especially because of language barriers. And honestly, Aidan is probably better placed to talk about this because of Aya, but I feel like, we've been doing some work with groups in India and Kenya and Brazil starting this year. Last year it was our sort of participatory input work started much more Western centered. It was much easier for us to do, and I think it was a good starting point. This year doing much more kind of international work, and I think it's like definitely got challenges, and I think especially because we're kind of like situated in the US, it's I think subsidiarity is very important. That's the idea of decisions being made at a level that is most local to kind of the people who are affected. Like some people are like, oh, we need global governance structures of AI. We need to like have a global institution. I'm like, I don't know if we really need that. I think that methods that enable people in different geographies to have decision-making power or governance power over the models that they use, over that is pursuant to their cultural values around their language, etc. I'm from New Zealand, so I like really love the kind of Te Hiku media work, and I think that is super, super important. And it is interesting However, when you think about, like, I think that work is really important. I think how to square the circle of, there are still companies that are making globally relevant decisions over the models that they're deploying that are being globally used. And what do you do about that? Like when things can't just be at a local scale, when things are already at a pretty global scale, like how do you bring some of that local wisdom in? How do you create the methods to have kind of like input across those geographies and cultures, et cetera, at the models that which are already operating at a more global level, I think is a really interesting challenge. And yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Saffron. I think a lot of what you said there resonates, and it's making me think I need to do another version of this talk, but find folks that are doing some of that international work to contribute as well. Not that your perspectives aren't fantastic and brilliant. We're running up to time. This always happens. I'm a terrible moderator. There was a whole other question that I wanted to get to, but we've got 3 minutes left of the session. I want to respect both of your time, but also the time of the folks listening in. So maybe what I'll do is the final question was around kind of barriers and challenges that we need to overcome, which I feel like we've discussed kind of, maybe not explicitly, but it's been a theme throughout a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. So maybe as sort of a wrap up final thought from each of you just on is there one particular thing that you would I guess love to see kind of more folks paying attention to, or one particular thing that you think those interested in working in AI governance and tech governance can do to make sure that participation is a bigger part of the work, or just one final closing thought from the conversation, whatever you want to say in about 30 seconds to wrap up the call. Tina, I can see you thinking hard, and I'm sure there's brilliant thoughts coming together. I'm gonna put you on the spot.
You're gonna put me on the spot. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we have to acknowledge that working with external stakeholders, working with impacted communities takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes a lot of learning and unlearning. And we have to make accommodations for that in our AI, both governance processes and but particularly in the development process, because I think that is what's sort of driving the speediness through which we're trying to scramble and come up with solutions so quickly that are somewhat incomplete at the moment. And they don't let us sort of drive towards some of the sort of deeper, bigger questions that we need to ask ourselves as a society. And so, one, I want to emphasize that. And two, I want to recognize that this work is really difficult because no community is a monolith. And so you're going to get conflicting information. And this is where I think things get challenging, where we have to make some really hard decisions around what values we're going to promote and codify versus ones that we're going to have to say, like, we can't speak to that. And so obviously the work that we do, we really think about social equity. And so we're thinking a lot about what are the needs and rights of those who exist at the margins of society, that have been ignored, that do oftentimes bear the brunt of a lot of the harms that comes from this kind of innovation. But that means prioritizing some over a majority. And I think, to your point, like, oftentimes that leads us to better products. Like, the curb cut effect is very, very real. But in the moment when you're making those decisions, it feels really hard. And I think we just have to grapple with the fact that, like, yes, we're going to listen more perhaps to folks that come from the queer community because they get targeted, because they get abused. And we need to build around them and see what happens, as opposed to making the decision to not, because it means that we'll on the face, we might accidentally seem like we're not, recognizing the rights and needs of, say, cis hetero people. But I think there's a lot of complexity here. And I just want to reassure everyone, this is really, really hard to do. It takes time. It takes a lot of expertise, but you should be doing it. It's exciting work. It's great to talk to people. People are great and they're fun. But yeah, I just want to acknowledge that this work is challenging, and there is no sort of quick and easy way around it. And that, working with smaller communities, developing some of that nuance expertise and through like good qualitative data is really, really important.
Thank you, Tina. I think that's a great closing and parting thought, and I have experienced it myself. It's hard work, but it is always valuable. Saffron, we're right up against time. Final parting thought from you to wrap up the conversation.
Yeah, I think this is tough, but I think one thing I'll say is like not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think this is something you'd actually mentioned in your email to me, Aidan, but just like, I think it's not easy work, but what we need is lots of people doing it around the world in the way that makes sense in their context, makes sense in their kind of community. We don't like we can't just have like one small set of very credentialed experts kind of doing it in a very specific way that they're trained to do it. And so I think just like I think that's kind of like our philosophy of like, okay, let's not say like this is the answer, like this is the method, the method that we tried is like the right thing, but more kind of being like, it was better that this happened than nothing happened. And we will build on this and get better. And yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that's also a nice answer to the it's hard work as well. It's hard work, but experiment, give something a try, and we'll all get there together. Thank you so much, both. I really appreciate your time. I always enjoy having a conversation with each of you, and I've really enjoyed this session. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone that's joined and stayed for the whole session as well. We do these monthly, so keep an eye out for the next one of these topics, still TBD, but I'm sure it will be interesting. And we will send round the links on Twitter and LinkedIn via Cohere For AI that Tina and Saffron have shared with us. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your days wherever you are in the world. And thank you again, Tina and Saffron.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.